Okay, so welcome to the Node.js Community Package Maintenance Working Group meeting for July 29th, 2019. We'll be following the agenda that was set in issue number, oops, let me see if I can find that. Issue number 3232. And we'll start out by seeing if there is any announcements that people would like to share. Doesn't look like there's announcements today. So okay, moving on to the first issue on the list. I think actually the first thing we should talk about is the issue related to choosing a new meeting time. This is 2:25, and let's just take a look at that one. The last suggestion was, I think, alternating between 9 and 3 on Tuesdays. But as Wes pointed out, that overlaps with the new CPC meeting time, right?
Yeah, I don't know if the overlap of people is that high, but I know that I would like to be able to attend both. So.
Yeah, and myself as well.
So the reason I raised that question originally was because we were having a European afternoon time, Monday morning US time, I suppose, meeting. And I think there was only 2 or 3 of us. So that's why I was thinking that maybe there's a better time for more people to join. It might have been just summer, of course.
I have to say, the Monday morning, I'm the least likely to have looked at my schedule on Sunday night,
Right.
to wake up at 6 a.m.
Yeah.
So yeah, Tuesday I'd be fine waking up at and going, but it's hard on Monday morning.
So I guess it's like, I'm just looking at the schedules, and on Tuesdays. So yeah, 3 at 4, there's a build working group meeting, although that's less frequent. I'm just looking like, say if we pushed it to say 4 or one other direction, right? Or is it actually that both, is it the 12 o'clock? No, the 9 is okay, right? It's the 3 p.m., the one that would conflict. Actually, across project 1 is at 2. It's 12 and 2 from the calendar. Is that unless it's in the wrong? So 1800 UTC. What is that? 1800. Is 2 p.m. So I think 3 might be okay. Unless I got that wrong.
I think maybe something changed since I posted that comment.
That is possible.
Get this because there's been a few other things. So.
Right, because okay, so the final place it is now is 1600 and 1800. So 1600, I think, is 12 and 2 for the CPC. And we were talking about 9 and 3 at my times. So I think actually we might be fine with 9 and 3 if that makes sense to everybody who's on the call. So maybe is everybody in agreed that we should switch over to those 2 times starting from the next meeting?
I am, and that would be Tuesday, correct?
Yeah, Tuesday at 9 EST and 3 p.m. EST. Any objections to that?
No.
No? Okay, we'll give that a try. Obviously, if it doesn't work out, we'll adjust, but okay, that's good. So let us move.
Is Rick a panelist right now? He had a comment in the
Yep.
chat.
Sorry, I need to Rick. There we go. Promote panelist. Yep. Yeah, so Rick, that was, oh, give him a second to get on.
Hi.
Hi,
Sorry about lateness. I was just asking which days I missed them. Was it still going to Tuesdays?
yes.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I think we had a discussion. I think the CPC went through a bunch of iterations. In the end, it looks like we're not going to conflict, so we figured we'd stick with that 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. Eastern and whatever else that ends up in people's time zones.
Perfect.
Okay. So let's move on to the next issue, which is support file number 220. Let me just open it up. I know there's been quite a lot of discussion since our last meeting. And I know that I'm just checking to see. Well, I guess we don't have. Glenn was working to try and see if we could get consensus. So I don't know that there's a next step in there. Other than, I guess, the main two issues were like a separate file or not. And if there was a separate file, how do we get the latest version of that? Because I think if it's in the package, Jason, we can just use NPM to give us that data today.
I have my hand raised.
Yep, go ahead.
So it seems like, just to make sure we're all on the same page, it seems like there's no contention around the format, that it should be JSON. There's rough agreement on like the actual content of it. And that's
Yep.
something we can continue to bike shed on
Yep.
issues if we need to. And the only real remaining question was, should the field in package JSON point to a file or a URL, or should it contain the content inline? And I also assume that there's rough agreement that it should be one of those things and probably not more than one. So given that last point of contention, I'm led to believe that there were some comments at the Node Summit by a few folks that wanted it to not be inline in package JSON. I feel pretty strongly that it should be. I don't know if it's worth talking about that in the meeting or if we want to keep doing it on GitHub. I think that the trade-offs basically are that if it's inline, then the downside is that you need a publish to update it. The upside is that you don't need to download the entire package to get that information. You can just type npm show and some stuff and get it. If it's a separate file in the package, then you still need a publish to update it. And also, you can't get it without downloading the whole tarball. So it seems to me like that's strictly the worst of those three options. And then with a URL, the upside is that you can update it without publishing a new version. The downside is that then somebody has to get the metadata and then also make a separate hop to look up the support information. Another possible downside of a URL is that it won't be as immutable as the package, which means that the URL could go down and disappear off the web, even though the package will be around forever. So obviously I'm biased because I have a preference, but like that's kind of roughly how I see the trade-offs. So if anyone has a really strong opinion a different way, I mean, we seem to have addressed most of the quirks by saying that whatever the latest version is cancels out all the previous ones. So if you do make it require a publish, then the latest chronological one published just trumps all the previous ones. But anyway, sorry, go ahead if you have a comment.
No. You actually addressed the main concern that I had was what you addressed at the very end there. That is the rule that the newest publish trumps everything. I still think that doesn't account for one of our bigger problems, which is the author dropping off, completely.
Mm-hmm.
So do we have any resolution on what we would want to do in that case? Is that the expires field? Like what's our solution there?
I mean, the expires field has some suggestions that I think mitigate that a lot, but I also think that I could always say expires never and then still vanish. If I do vanish, then whether it's a URL or in the package, it's just as likely that it could vanish. And I would argue it's more likely that the URL would vanish in that case, because I could stop paying for my domain names. So to me, that none of the options alter the calculus of that. It's just, that's more like, maybe we should have expires, or maybe we should not allow never or something. You know, but I think that's something that is not particularly contentious, and we could continue to discuss in terms of like what goes in the data.
Yeah, in that case, then I think I'm on board with the inline, which I was not previously, but I think we've resolved all the issues that I had with that. Maybe one other suggestion that we could do would be whatever tooling we provide around this, we maybe put a repo that has exceptions somewhere, so that when we have tooling and that somebody does drop off the face of the earth, we can, you know, have somebody open a PR on a repo we maintain that we'll check against to say like, hey, this is no longer the support, you know, this is a non-supported, or something, where any tooling would have a fallback that would allow.
That's a great idea. There's a tool called licensee that maintains a separate repo for license corrections for that exact purpose. And it's works really well so far. So that's great. I think I saw a comment that Ahmed had a hand up.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Just a quick kind of note on the separation of files or not. In so much that we're talking about the JavaScript ecosystem here, those values and those fields don't necessarily need to be limited by that. So in trying to make it in line with package.json, we lose out on the opportunity of adoption across the board in that context. To the point of the version-wise or publish-wise, you always lose out on the most recent one, or things might change between version A and version 1, version 2. That's where potentially having it as a separate file and having the provider level or a third-party level, like a service type of information on the latest, being outside of the context of an install step or a CLI command, so that you have an authoritative source to determine that logic for you, as opposed to whatever is in line will always be the determining factor, because you might be on an older version that declared a level of support that the author has changed their mind afterwards. So that, to me, that's where the inline context comes in, from the perspective of having an authoritative logic that determines what is the most effective and recent view of things, and as well as putting it in package.json kind of as a very JavaScript opinionated thing, which is fine, but there's value in those kind of standards that we're talking about that can apply to other communities as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. I guess I feel that the only authority is an NPM registry, because everything else can and does vanish. And so like there's other ecosystems probably have similar things where like the package registry holds the immutable data, and everything else, even if it's unlikely to be changed, like GitHub repos and stuff, is still technically mutable and could vanish at any time. So like I'm sensitive to that, but I feel like we can address that by saying, no matter what's in your package.json, always run, always check the registry for the latest published version. Or you could even say, we could even be very specific and say what's under the latest tag is the latest support. So that covers like pre-release and deprecated versions, so. Anyway.
From the vanishing perspective, in my mind, like the URL no longer being there means it's not supported. So actually the vanishing is not necessarily a bad thing in my mind. Like if you're not able to keep that up, then that's a clear signal to whatever tool is running that there's a problem. Now, if it's intermittent, that could be a different thing, right? Somebody else was...
Yeah. Regarding the fact that we're debating putting in a line, I am sort of in favor of keeping it in package.json, but aside from that, if we're saying that the registry is the canonical source of that information, so I think NPM already reports through the API when you retrieve the document, it includes the README. Would it be a major change to include an additional field which reads from another well-known file?
So I'll raise my hand and say, we're committed in terms of collaboration on this front of what makes most sense for the community to introduce that either as an API interface dedicated or advanced, like on top of what we have already. I've also initiated a conversation with GitHub and Open Collective on these type of files and determining funding levels and supporting levels, because there's an overlap there. So I want to, selfishly, as a open source community member, I want to see a single kind of interface that can represent those type of things, and we at NPM will represent that as well in a meaningful way. And I'm looking at this initiative as part of a driver for that context of, what is that file format looks like? What is that interface for declaration of these type of activities and support level look like? And we'll be able to represent that meaningfully in both in our APIs and the CLI as well.
But I have a question in regards to that. I really like that idea, but I think that risks not getting a good solution in place today because we're waiting on all these other communities to resolve what they think might be best. Is there anything that we could do or change about the spec that we have that would make it a little bit more forward compatible if we decided to say like mix, an external file with an internal, or with, I say external file, another file format and package JSON? Is there anything, we could change about it today to make that future easier?
My suggestion would be like, yes, good point. Like, I don't want to say wait for a collective coming together and agreeing, or yet another working group of that sort. But it would be nice if we all get together on the same page on that front. What I would suggest is if you have a reference in a package of JSON to that file, that makes it a lot easier in terms of current tool sets and current setup to become a pointer effectively. And to your point, Dominicus, earlier, like we can use the API as it is today and just pulling that content of that file and just, CLI tooling wise, even if it's a third-party CLI functionality that you introduce, and then later we can, update the NPM CLI itself to have more of those functionality. Use what we have already, use what we're in front of us so that we don't delay the work. There's no reason to wait on that front. But just make it, to your point, Wes, forward compatible, I guess is the right word, or progressive enhancement, to use a web term.
So one thing I wanted to mention real quick is it's been a feature request for NPM for like 7 years to have a way to update the README without publishing a patch. If there was a way to do that, then I presume there would also be a way to designate explicit supporting files like support.json or funding.json and update them without a new release. At that point, it would be very trivial to, and this of course requires a little work on NPM side, but you could have every NPM install just pull those files from the canonical source and not from the tarball. You could, and just kind of virtually bundle them together. You could have an NPM read the data command that just pulls from the latest version without needing to download the tarball. There's lots of ways to handle that, but I think that the ability to update without the documentation without publishing is, I think, pretty critical to that. And I would rather see work go into doing that on the README than on the support file if it's going to go anywhere first, because that's a long-standing pain point. And I think that in a world where that ability existed, this would be a very different conversation.
Yeah, I'll take that in. I would also say all these feedbacks are definitely more than welcome anytime, anywhere. I don't want to make it so that this is an NPM dependent thing, nor an NPM specific conversation. Like in the context of the OpenJS Foundation here, let's make that, independent of that, because it's NPM, going forward may not they'll be the only registry in the world. So these type of functionalities have to be applied everywhere, especially for people who are going to be publishing on GitHub or open source registries or so on. So I'm also very, very sensitive to those saying, don't make the dependency onto NPM to do something. That doesn't mean we're not going to do something.
Right. So I trying to parse what we would do today as it sounds like longer term, a URL which has a reference makes sense. Is there something we can do today? Is it a combination of today you put it in the package JSON and include the URL, which is the authoritative source? Or
well, I mean, we could start with inline now and then expand the schema later to say if the object is just an object with the key href, then that points to a URL. Or if it's just a key with, I don't know, some other key, we can have it point to a relative file. There's lots of ways we can expand it to, gracefully migrate to that world when those abilities are present. I don't think we have to necessarily make that decision now.
Agreed.
I would only expand on that and saying URI instead of URL, because that also includes the local file context. So your link could be just inline, like a file in the package itself.
Right. So URI, you said? Okay.
I think they call them all URLs now. They got rid of the terminology URI. Yeah, a file URL is the same.
So, okay. So does it sound like maybe we have agreement that today we'd start with inline, but you can either put the JSON inline or you can make it an object, which is a URI, URL. We'll figure out the right terminology to whatever you want that contains the same JSON.
Well, whether we ship both abilities at the same time or not, I'm suggesting we start with inline because we accept that we can expand future to be a URL. And if we want to ship both at the same time, we can talk about doing that too. But given that we don't yet have the ability to update them without publishing, that seems to me to be like I prefer we not implement that right now.
I see, because you can't change it, although you can. It would let you, if it was pointing to something you could change that without a publish.
Sure. And if it's pointing to a file within the package, then we're at the place where it requires an update still. And also you can't get it without downloading the tarball. So that doesn't seem valuable. And then unless there's an API to get it without the whole tarball and an API to update it without publishing a patch.
But the author could get it. The author could make that be in their GitHub repo, which they could actually update.
And then you have a resource that could vanish at any time. And
right, but
so
it vanishes. That just means to me like there's no support. And it's like that seems okay.
I mean, that's true, but sometimes that might also it might be useful to still have the data. Like it might say everything is supported until this time, or security releases, you can email me here. And I'm not even talking about vanishing in terms of an intentional deletion by the author, but if it points to a URL that's their own domain name and then they forget to pay for it, then they might still support their package, but the support data might be inaccessible.
Right.
Like DNS is just kind of brittle. So ideally we don't rely on anything that isn't installed when you type npm install. That's where my philosophy is coming from here. So even if we accept a URL, I would prefer it be a relative URL inside the package and not a generic HTTPS or something URL for these reasons.
So the current proposal is maybe just inline now in that case, or inline. I guess the two options at the end is inline now or inline or a relative URL.
Right. And we can do inline now and add a relative URL later.
Right.
That's forward compatible.
I'm on board with waiting to decide whether we want to do URLs. I think that's the easiest one. And once there's a compelling reason to add it, we go ahead and add it. I think today we have enough questions around it that committing to it is questionable. And if we can move forward on a recommended standard and iterate later, then I think we win because we can start getting people on board today.
So anybody else have any comments, objections to that being our path forward?
I would like only to add to the conversation that I asked myself when a user need the support file, because of course Hamad talked about the CI integration, of course, but for example, I think people would check the support when he had to choose which libraries, which modules have to use, for example. And for of course, when the user check for support, he maybe won't open an issue, for example. So for this reason, I think that the URL or something that is online would fit better our needs instead of the publish, of course, npm. But it's okay also the inline and add in future in href property, for example.
If to that point, if we did some small integration with NPM and GitHub where they were displaying this on repos in a more digestible format, would that satisfy your concern?
Absolutely, yes.
So there's another feature request for NPM.
I guess once we got to get something in place, and then we can get them to make it more visible. So I have to drop off, but do we want to continue that discussion? In which case, I'll just hand it over to Emily and move on, or is there one last sort of summary I should capture before doing that?
The only thing is that I would like more, if there's more concrete information to be had about the folks at the summit who said that they did not want it inline, about their reasons. I've heard that it makes package JSON longer, and then that it requires a publish to update. Those were their concerns. If there's another, if someone could like enumerate those online, like on GitHub, that would be helpful.
Okay, I mean, the only ones I remember were one, yeah, it adds to the parsing of package JSON, and there was you actually want to be able to update it dynamically, was the two.
Okay.
I think the other one was that it wasn't, it was specific maybe to,
Right.
to JavaScript.
Right. I think that we could handle through the documentation of saying, you know, if you don't use it with JavaScript, put it in a separate file called X.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Emily, I'm going to
yeah.
hand over the chairmanship to you. Some more, make host. And if you can take us through the rest of the agenda, sorry.
Yep.
To drop off. Talk to you guys, talk to everybody later.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, so the next issue is 218. I'm opening that up. And I'm seeing that there's a bullet point, reach out to Travis to get option that includes. Is that for this one? And the title for this one is support field to support license. Manuel, is this yours or did you?
Yes, this is the issue related to the PR that we have just discussed. So I think that is the same.
Okay, is there anything else we want to discuss on this or just go to the next one?
I would only to say that there is a pending comment on the format on the expire field that is an ISO 8601 format. So this discussion could continue on GitHub, but I would only to say this.
So discussion can continue there?
Yeah, there was a comment by Jordan about it.
Yeah, I just, it sounds like a standard format, but it also seems really confusing and hard to understand. So like, you know, I wouldn't block on that, but it seems like a nice, we should try and find a better balance between readability and standardization for a field, for a file that is likely to be worked with by both machines and humans.
Okay, maybe we could try to check if there are other ISO format in order to, of course, be more standard as possible. So I will check deeper.
Cool. I think we can talk more on GitHub. I mean, if we don't find anything better, then something standard is better than nothing, obviously. So.
Perfect.
Just writing the note, continue combo in GitHub. All right, so moving to 205.
I guess I can give a quick update on that. Yeah, so basically I sent an email to Travis support asking them if they could join the discussion. That was coming out of the stats that we did a quick check to spot that most of the Travis YAML files out there do not test in the latest LTS version. So I reached out to Travis, asking them whether they'd be interested in discussing this to see how we can change the defaults or whether they're interested in other options. What they did is they said they're moving ahead with changing the default. So the default, unless you specify any versions in Travis, will soon be, I haven't checked when exactly that's going out, but will soon be the latest LTS version rather than latest Node version. So that will be a nice improvement, although there are some trade-offs there, right? Because right now the community is sort of ahead of the recommended production for the apps. So that's why I would really be interested in seeing if we can discuss with Travis whether they would be considering an option to make the default the multiple versions. I know Jordan had some concerns there. But basically, that's where we're at. And based on the changes that Travis are making, I think I can start working on the blog post that I have on the in the plans to basically write something up about which versions people should be generally testing with. There's another small thing there, which is sort of related to the package support as well, I guess. Basically, Renovate. They do automatic updates of your dependencies, and they can also bump the versions of Node in your Travis YAML. And they have a grammar for specifying which versions you want to take in. And I think we can maybe take that grammar and build on top of that and reuse that grammar for the support field, as well as in which Node versions do you support. And they have a couple of options there, like LTS, latest LTS, active LTS. So there's all these different levels. So, but I guess I'll open up a separate issue for that, or maybe a PR for the support stuff. So yeah, that's where we're at with that.
So I'm not sure. I'm hoping to have time in the next week or two to add a feature to NVM where you could do like LTS -1, LTS -2, and so on, minus however many, at which point, and so it may be useful, if I'm going to have that time to do it, then it may be useful to have Travis hold off a minute, because then they could default it to the oldest LTS instead of the newest. And that way the default would kind of keep pulling forward, but it would be the most compatible and not the most edge version. So I'm going to try to have the time. I left my job a few weeks ago, but I also have 2 kids. So, but yeah, I intend to add that feature regardless. My concerns were about the ergonomics of having a default matrix of like 4 versions of Node and then adding one thing to your YAML file and having it flip to one version. But if Travis is comfortable with that, then I have no say in it. And if Travis has a better solution than that, then awesome. But either way, it's reasonable to ask for like a, -n feature in NVM. So I'm going to try and build that.
I have a sort of tangential question here. Are we concerned at all about our recommendation being so dependent on a company and their product in this regard? So, right, weren't they recently bought by somebody, and there's been some questions on whether or not the product will remain what it has been? I'm just concerned if we're going to start recommending even more around this, that we do our due diligence in that regard.
Yeah. So where I'm coming from is I took a scan that there was a top 1,000 NPM modules posted recently. I scanned all of their repos, and 90% of them use Travis. Okay, so de facto, they're the standard. Okay, there's no other CI systems in the world as it stands. So that's why I would really, really, really love if people from Travis could join, but I haven't gone as far as poking them on Twitter or GitHub without any sort of prior contact. So if anybody knows anybody, please go ahead. I posted a link to the Travis About page on the issue. Maybe you know somebody there or something like that. It would be really great if they could participate, because the way it is, as you're saying, they are one of the critical infrastructure companies for the open source, right? So ideally, we'd have them in these discussions here.
So I'm
from
actually
from what it seems is that the development continues, right? They're building a feature and they're making some changes and responding to support requests.
I can make an intro to the team there if that's of interest. I know the folks who are working on directly on the open source side of things. They reached out to me, so I can connect you if you're interested.
I also just dropped a message in their Slack. They have like a channel for external people to be in, and for NVM I'm in there, so I'll try and get them involved. But yeah, I do have the same concerns that were brought up about their acquisition and their layoffs and the uncertain future of it. But they're also the like 99.999% used solution. So while I hope that we can offer recommendations for services beyond Travis, Azure and Circle and things like that, if we don't have Travis, we've like really missed the mark.
Okay, anything else on this one? Moving on to 192. Next steps on support levels in package JSON. Pulling that up. Okay, this looks like a checklist that Michael was working on, and Manuel maybe?
Yes.
Any
But
updates?
yes, I think that this issue is blocked by the support file. So because this is a list of a to-do list, it's a to-do list. So in order to do, we have to decide for the support file. So I will complete, of course, the pull request with the feedback that we have decided today. So I think that it will be unlock next few days.
There's music playing if I keep muting and unmuting myself. Okay, so probably will be unblocked in the next couple days. Does that capture enough of what you're talking about? I'm updating it in the Google Doc. Manuel?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Moving to 164. Bring that up. Baseline practices, npm ignore or package.json files. This was talked about a little bit in a different issue. Anybody want to take or familiar with this one? LJ, Dominicus have commented on this one, but it looks like.
Yeah. So I mean, I have a lot of strong feelings here.
Yeah.
There's basically two methods. There's npm ignore and files. npm's official docs have mentioned files for a long time, but I think it's like a terrible and dangerous practice. And so either way, I think we need to recommend both approaches. And we've kind of talked through it a lot and arrived at a sort of let's recommend based on two mindsets. One mindset is you're really, really concerned with the size of the tarball that people download when they type npm install. And in that world, you want to restrict some files from being published. How do you do it? Here's the two ways. Here's the pros and cons. And I just, I'm going to be very interested in making sure that those are well represented, because I've said it on GitHub, so I won't repeat it here, but there's pros and cons there. And then if we go with the mindset of you are more concerned with people being able to access everything in their node modules folder offline, not have to check GitHub, things like that. Or if you just have a lack of concern about it, then don't have an npm ignore, don't have a files, things like the files array, things like that. So I think it's really just about coming up with those recommendations in a way that matches the enthusiasm of all the people with opinions here. and phrases them correctly with well-worded trade-offs that are both as unbiased as possible, but also as that don't minimize the real concerns of certain approaches. It's given that people have different priorities here, it's going to be tough to word it in a way that meets that goal. But I think that's where we're at, is that we just have to kind of iterate and come up with language that that doesn't try to shame people or make them feel bad for their priorities, but also acknowledges the true pros and cons of them, of all the different ones.
So it sounds like more discussion needs to be had here, or keep.
I just raised my hand, but I don't know if.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that we as a group can not have opinions on certain things, and that's fine, even if they relate to package maintenance. And I would hesitate for us to get involved in this type of discussion in a broader context unless there's a really important reason. So I think something like making a recommendation around package lock files being committed to your repos, fine. There's a real reason not to do that. We should say that's a best practice. Don't do it in your modules. This is very much, what does your module do? Why do you think it's not a good idea? Does your module have a large binary in it that should never be used by the downstream consumer? Then yeah, ignore it. But that's very much dependent on what your module is doing. And so I think it's reasonable for us to not publish best practices on some of these kind of things when there's just too much, variance. We could maybe publish help articles, and that's where I think we need to be very clear about what we're saying. We're saying this is we want to make some blog posts about this feature, which is very different than saying we want to recommend a best practice. So I think we just need to be very clear on what our scope is around some of these things, and de-scope something like this where it's just there's maybe not a good documentation source, but that's a different thing than recommending best practices as such.
So I think I generally agree with that, but the main concern I have is that NPM has official guidance on both of the things you mentioned. The NPM CLI strongly pushes everyone to commit package lock to their packages. And so it's actually really important that a best practice is propagated that combats this misinformation that's been going out for years. And similarly, the NPM documentation on the website mentions the files property without mentioning any of its downsides. And I get 20 PRs on my packages a year, easy, of people trying to add the files property to my package JSON, completely unaware of the downsides, and then citing NPM's documentation as an authoritative source. So I actually think that while I agree with you that we shouldn't be telling people use tabs or spaces, right? But we definitely we need to be establishing a balanced explanation of trade-offs, even if we're not calling it a best practice to do one or the other, or even a best practice to only do these things. I think we kind of are obligated to address that information in the community. So I think I see Amon's hand up.
Just want to comment, when we're talking about best practices as offering them to the community, we don't need necessarily to limit to a single best practice in contexts like this. You can give it a different profile or a different perspective, saying if you're a package maintainer and you really just want to distribute your compiled source code, here's a set of best practices around that, versus you're using it for different purposes and do you want to publish your test files or not, right? That's an interesting conversation. It doesn't have to be a single best practice, so you can potentially offer different kind of perspectives on it, and with that, maybe templates of npm ignore and what that looks like for different users. But I think it's a very broad topic at the end of the day. Of trying to cover that in a single stroke best practice is going to be very complicated. When it comes to what npm describes as the CLI perspective and how the CLI operates, I think that's how the whether it's an authoritative source or not, it's relevant to the way it's presented, as opposed to I'm just publishing packages and how do I want to share my files? So there's a bit of a nuance there, but we can talk about that more. Coming back to the original kind of point of this particular ticket, the original questions were asked around things like, do I include my code coverage file? Do I include my, test files and so on? And whether we want to try to publish a best practice in the kind of more broader sense or in different contexts, maybe we can address those, like categorize them in a meaningful way and just talk about, hey, meta files that are not part of your source code, should you publish those or not? Rather than the method in which you're going to declare what's included and what's not.
So in that regard, this is very much more of a, like, our goal for this task is we have a blog post, right, that goes out about this, not necessarily any tooling pieces, or actually, and it's maybe a blog post and maybe some updates to the NPM docs. Like, I'm just trying to understand what we see as like the end goal, for this issue.
Yeah, I was just about to say that NPM docs, they're open for pull requests, right? If we come up with a write-up, pros and cons, I'm sure we can, rather than stick them into our drafts folder and forget about them, it's probably better to propagate them upstream.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going back to the origin of the ticket, like the first topic posed there. Like, it started out with the concept of coverage files and NYC output files and ESLint RC files, and should those be included or not, right? But like, I know how the conversation started moving towards other areas, and I've seen Joel try to clarify a number of times, talking about DS store files and NYC outputs and so on. It sounds like there's two different topics here. If you want to talk about a blog post potentially as or a guideline or best practice, then maybe the blog post can ask the question and we don't have to come up with the answer, and see what the reception looks like.
Well, and I think even just identifying user stories and being like, this is an example of somebody who cares about these things, and this is what they did, and this is why. And this is an example of someone who cares about different things, and this is what they did, and this is why. And, like, we don't have to moralize on it and call it a best practice necessarily, but it's really useful to be able to show in kind of an exemplar for the different paths, so that everyone's not just running over the lawn,
I'll reread the issue, but I think that a lot of the stuff that was talked about is really good and should maybe be moved to that discussion as well. I tried to capture as much as I could in the notes, but I do very much like the idea of having different use cases and maybe a blog post to ask people what they think too. I could probably copy paste this into the issue, I guess, after this is done. Any more on that one? Move to 113. I'm not sure where this is at, but this is which problems Node.js OSS maintainers and authors face today.
So maybe I can talk a little bit about this, since I did just submit the Express answers, I think, last week. It looks like both. So the only two pilot packages or pilot groups that we did was MQTT and Express, and both, I think, highlighted we need triage help. I think that was the overwhelming takeaway from the answers to the questions. I don't know if we had specific deliverables. I know Express, we've talked about, and we have a meeting later this week to talk about how we can concretely improve the situation around getting people to help us triage. I don't know if MQTT has had any similar, like, here's what we're going to do to try to improve the situation. So I don't know what next steps are on it. Maybe it's just, the two groups need to get on the call together and say like, yeah, this would work for both of us. Because Express, we're going to talk about it on Wednesday. What we're going to do is we're going to have 3 tiers of issues, and so we're going to try to maintain tags on the repos that will help direct users to where to go. So we're going to have the triage ones will be the newest opened issues, one's labeled question and one's labeled discuss. So those are just question and discuss are ones that Express is already using across most of our repos to, just signal to people, hey, these are still up for grabs. If you have opinions, come talk about it. And then the newest ones are just, will be the unlabeled. And so I'm working on a little tool that will give us like a status page that will be across all of the repos on all of the orgs that will get all those and keep them up to date. Then there's the second level, which is the top 10, we're calling it, but it's really just not necessarily 10 issues that will be agreed upon by the Express CTC. At any given time, it might be just a PR to the list or something, but the idea is that would be for people who have a little bit of context around the project and want to contribute more comprehensive things. They would be able to go to that list and see, oh, okay, here's where I can actively contribute. These are things that are blessed by the core maintainers. And then the last one is the top level objectives. So those would be like big picture things. So for Express, the things like that, it would be like HTTP2 support, docs, like those are big initiatives that we have. And those would be for people who really have context and want to push the project forward. So that's the plan that we have for Express. And I don't know, I guess Matteo is not on the call, but he's the point person for MQTT. So if he likes that approach, maybe that's something that we could come up with some sort of standard document around and say like, look, this is what we're going to do moving forward. But I think Express is going to be moving on this one way or the other. So I don't know if that matters so much here. But.
I would like to say that there is a board for the help backlog, let's say, of the pilot packages. I think that we could find or think how to help Express, but also give some tooling that could help some other repo. This, let's say, duplex helpful engagement. So for example, right now I have created already for the MQTT some ideas that came out. So I think that we could add for Express how do the triage. There is some tooling. Wes say that is building a tool for get some statistics across all the repo. So I think that could be useful for all the community, for example, of course, if you want to share. So these kind of things where we can work on and go further, and helping, of course, these pilot packages. For example, for MQTT, the word tool, we have let's say a cloud with the words that are often said. This was kind helpful, but we didn't. We did only a POC, a POC. So it's not complete yet, but it's quite good for now, for example. So we could use it for the triage Express test, for example.
Yeah, I will take a look at that. I do think one thing I should put on the priority list here is, and I can do this manually for the first time, but I will take our Express issues and do just like you did in this board, and I'll make issues that point to the Express ones here. I think that's a great start, and I can do that after our meeting on Wednesday when we finalize our list. And then from an automation standpoint, anything, I'll take a look at this word tool, and maybe we can collaborate. I did create a GitHub and NPM organization called PKG.js. My intent was to publish this tool there for that exact goal of like, here's where we'll share it for other ecosystems. I don't know how much other ecosystems have the problem that Express does, is that we're split across GitHub orgs and repos, and like heavily split. Like there's, I think, probably like 40 repos that are actively maintained across 3 different GitHub orgs. So the specific tooling I was building was to try to consolidate that. I don't know if that's something other people have, but you know, if MQTT has that as well. If not, maybe we can reach out, because like, you know, like Babel and some of these other big ones, they're all really consolidated. They have, sometimes they're even a mono repo. And Express just has the opposite problem. So I don't know, you know, if we want to solve for both or what, but I think that'd be a point to collaborate on with some of these other ecosystems that are bigger, like Express is.
If we solve a bigger problem, we solve also the smaller one.
I also, in your questionnaire, you mentioned, and I believe Matteo as well mentioned in that in MQTT, the release process. Are there any discussions happening on that anytime soon? Because I've been working 2 fronts there at work, and there's obviously semantic release, which automates a lot. If you adopt certain conventions, and then there's the other thing that Neoform has built as part of their sort of experimental exploration type thing, is something that should be actually a part of core NPM, but things are the way they are. So there's an experimental tool which allows remote OTP requests, which means that you can publish using 2FA from CI directly, right? So CI makes a request, you receive a notification on your phone, you click approve, the package is published, you click reject, the package is not published. So we have a thing like that, and yeah, I'm happy to assist there if there's some discussions that we can join or something.
I would be willing to add that to our meeting, because that's one of the topics Doug and I have discussed sort of offline a bit, is what, so at some point, Doug removed basically everybody from publish rights on NPM. There was a security concern, and this was before 2FA. So, you know, and with Express, this is very important, specifically because of the reach. He just removed everybody, which is a really bad thing for contributors, right? Because now, like, even me, I can't publish. I have to ping Doug, you know, to publish things, which doesn't give a good story for contributor growth, right? Because you need to feel ownership, and you need to feel like you're part of it. And you know, obviously, I still feel ownership, even though I'm, you know, not able to publish. But I think for a lot of people, being able to publish the packages and their work is a big step. But we can't open that until we have a good solution for the automation and security concerns. So if you have stuff on that, I think we'd absolutely love to hear about it and talk about how we can utilize that and be involved. So if you're interested in coming to the meeting, I'll put that on the agenda, and we can get you on the call.
What time is that, Wednesday?
Let me double check here. I think it's 4:30 Pacific. So I'll post it in the I'll put it in the agenda. I'll put a link.
Thank you.
And I think we're out of time. Did anyone have any last minute items? Great. Well, we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Thanks.